Hello, book lovers. I'm Phil Svitek, joined alongside yet again Marisa Serafini. It is our monthly book club discussion. Today, we are diving deep into Ursula K Le Guin's The Word for World is Forest. Now, we're going to talk about the book, the plot, so we're going to get into spoiler territory fairly soon, but we'll also give you some context about her life. We'll go into themes of the book and all of that. And I would like to also encourage you to check out past book discussions we've done. We've done almost a year's worth. We do one a month. So we're excited to approach the 1 year anniversary, and we'll tell you what books we're going to be reading in the future as well. But of course, you're welcome to comment with any suggestions you would, recommend to us. And, we want this to be a community. But without further ado, let's just kind of dive into it, starting with overall impressions by you, Marisa.
Yeah, when you suggested this book, I had never heard of the author, and then going a little bit into her history, which we'll get into, you realized that it was science fiction and all that. So I was like, all right, sign me up. And then reading this, I thought it was really interesting because I think it was well crafted in the way of seeing the viewpoint of other different characters and how they see each other and how they think about each other and how they describe each other. And you can tell like the strong opinions from one to another. And so I always thought that's an interesting viewpoint when you're trying to learn about people and character and books and stories and worlds and stuff like that. And then overall, I enjoyed the overall theme of just like humanity, like what defines us as humans, what defines us as just people living amongst each other, and how we see each other, and just like the humanity aspect of a story, what makes us right and wrong and all that. And I think there are a lot of those messages and undertones in this book, and I really appreciated that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, I'm very much in this kick of end of the world type of stories and fantasy for my own sort of storytelling research. Um, and because of that, I saw this book as one. By the way, are you there? Did you hear me?
You kind of cut off there a little bit.
Um, okay.
Is that
What part did
mine or yours?
I have no clue. What part did you last hear?
Like the first 5 seconds of your thing.
All right.
Yeah, I heard mine, and then that was it.
Okay. So I'll just retake it.
5 minutes in.
Yeah. So for me, Ursula is an author that I very much have heard about, respected, and I've read a few of her short stories, and she has a very different style in each of the stories, right? And for me, I was very much in this sort of end of the world crave of reading simply because for my own like research purposes of stories that I'm trying to work on. So this was kind of top of the list, and it's a very short book. It's less than 200 pages. I mean, it's a novella really, and so that kind of spawned it. And yeah, I didn't really know what to expect, and I knew part of it was it had been heavily compared to Avatar. This was very much written way before Avatar was even a thing by James Cameron. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to compare and contrast in that way. And overall, it's a simple story, but I think it goes pretty deep on some of that stuff overall. So yeah, that's kind of for me. But I do want, and part of it, why I chose, because in theory, it was a book that I could have read separately from us reading together. But I know we had made a effort to have more women authors highlighted. And for me, like, what better person than like, this is an American novelist who has done so much, but I don't think is as widely regarded, like by authors, yes, but in the grander world. For example, so she wrote The Left Hand of Darkness in 1969, and for this, she won the Hugo and Nebula Awards for Best Novel, becoming the first woman to do so. Right, so that's an incredible accomplishment, and for almost like 50 years, she was really known as the voice of science fiction, and yet not, so she's had success, but it's not part of the mainstream culture. And there's been a series of movies made about her work called the Earthsea series, which is much more fantastical than science fiction. But yeah, so she's done a lot, and this book in particular, people have identified it as part of the Hainish universe, which is you don't what I like about it is you don't really need to know all of this. Like if you do, you can kind of explore more aspects of this lore and history, but this very much works as a standalone. Like you get the sense that there's something greater beyond what's happening in this story. And if you want to explore that, you can, but you don't need to as well. So
Yeah, and I loved how you brought up her accomplishments and stuff because, again, like I said at the beginning shows, like I have never heard of her, and I think it's really sad because no, going back into her repertoires, like she's written a lot and she's won a lot of awards. So like shame on me for not knowing, but also her stuff is 60s, 70s, and to be fair, that is before our generation. And I think it's really unfortunate that those accomplishments aren't as well acknowledged nowadays, and we should bring light to that again. And people need to know that just because we're not aware of her now, that her writing is still relevant years later, decades later, and X amount of wars later, because there are definitely militaristic undertones to the story as well. And I think that's what keeps her writing relevant, because there are a lot of universal themes today that we can still recognize.
yeah, and with all due respect to like Philip K. Dick, I mean, how many times does that guy get adapted in terms of movies, right? And
So
so
many times.
he's a contemporary of hers and things like that. So yeah, it is really a shame that it does feel like she's getting pushed down unrightly. And one of the things that I do appreciate about her writing style is very simplistic and very direct. And I also love, as you made mention, like there's the militarism aspect of it. She's very much a feminist, has studied Carl Jung. One of my favorites, Taoism. All that kind of seeps into her writing in one way, shape, or form, which I heavily appreciate. And speaking of this book in particular, actually, real quick, I want to highlight some authors that have outright said they've been wildly influenced by her writing. So Salman Rushdie, who we know because we've read him,
Yes.
David Mitchell, Neil Gaiman. I mean, talk about like sci-fi today and
Yeah,
fantasy,
we still love him. Yes.
and Leon Banks. So those are among those who look at her as just phenomenal inspiration. So, and what I appreciate about her work, and maybe this is a good entry point, her use of nonviolence as being a thing, right? That's core component to it, and it grapples with, is violence justified or not? And so I guess let's talk about that, because very early on, these creatures, as they're referred to as a pejorative, they're a non-violent folk, but then they take up violence. So, and that's the inciting incident.
Right. And it's also like the whole idea of every action has an opposite or equal reaction, and they took up violence because something else happened, because Davison did such a heinous crime of, rape and killing. So like one event happened and another event, which led to a violent event afterwards. So one violent and another violent, and and I gotta admit, like Davidson, I mean, what a jerk. I mean, I could say more bad things about him, but just his viewpoint of these creatures, you can already tell he has this false sense of superiority over these guys, and he looks down upon them. He's condescending. He calls them names. He, just because of their small stature and kind like features, basically he thinks of them inferior. And that just, you start with the discrimination and prejudice in there, and it just kind of snowballs and into his behaviors and how he treats them, how he talks about them, and how he acts around them. And so it kind of starts at the top with him, and which leads to all these following events afterwards that it increases to like more and more violence that I don't think anyone was really expecting.
Yeah, and it's also what was unexpected for me is we started off with him as not our protagonist, but we're following like the first chapter is from his point of view. And I was like, oh, this is a little different. Because I don't
Right.
think I'm, even just right away, I was like, I don't think I'm supposed to like him whatsoever. Like he seems pretty
Right.
heinous. And then it became evident of like, yeah, no, he's a heinous dude.
Yeah, he's a dick. And well, and that's the interesting thing is because I think had Le Guin written or started the book with a different character, I think it might have been easier to get into, but I think our feelings might have been different had we start like a with uh Lubyev or Selver, or someone who with a kinder viewpoint of the world and the people, it might have been easier to get into, and then we could see the complete contrast with Davison. But because she started with such an angry tone, it really, you can understand where the violence already started because we started at such a high level of hatred, and then it just kind of boils from there.
Yeah, and I think interestingly enough, like with obviously the benefit of hindsight looking at it, I think because we as the reader have such a sort of visceral reaction to this guy, I mean, there's a bunch of women that are carted off to this planet, and all he cares about in the midst of all of his duties is like, I need to get laid.
Mm-hmm.
And that's putting it very like gently, because he's certainly not talking in those terms. But by the end of the book, the whole idea is that even though, in any other story, this would be like a huge victory, right? Like they've essentially defeated the humans, so to speak, right? Except, Selver does not see it in that way. It's a very bittersweet ending because he knows now the genie's out of the bottle. The idea of killing people has now been introduced to, his people, and it cannot be undone. And so it's interesting to kind of reflect upon that, given that the first chapter kind of evokes that hatred within us as the reader of like, wow, I hate this person. And so it's driving us towards that same sort of reaction of all of it, and you can't put it back in, which I think is fascinating.
Right. It's like letting the cans out of the worm in that sense, but it's also when we read about the colonists, their actions towards these nice, I'm going to butcher the Athsheans.
A lot of hard pronunciations in this
Yeah, it
book.
was like a lot of hard consonants against each other. The original colonists there, uh, to see them, their description that they're non-violent, that they dream together, they work together, and like they have a shared visions in that sense, like they work as a community, and because they have like such an open communicative relationship with each other, that's how they can get things done because they're open to collaborate and work with each other. And then when we have another community that doesn't do that, and kind of exploits that against them, they're like, I feel like the colonists or the current colonists, the humans basically, um, they work individually because they don't work together. They work individually. They stand alone. They work on their own accord, and there's a lot of disconnect there. And everyone has their own motivations. And like Davison, he worked on his own and was violent. So like, had they worked together, there might not have been as much violence. Because when
Yeah.
you work as a whole, you're more likely to get something done successfully compared to working alone.
Yeah, and I think that's a key distinction because it's not like Davidson, not even within this realm, represents the viewpoint of the humans. I'm going to call him Raj. Raj is the anthropologist who, appreciates them and studies them. And even by the end, once the humans, especially HQ, have kind of been defeated, they're very much like, Davidson, what the hell are you doing? You're going to get us all killed. Don't stop. Like, just don't do whatever you're doing. Just stop. Whatever you're thinking, don't. And so, yeah, it's very much, in that sort of way of, chickens with their heads cut off, going every which way, and not having a collective. And that's when you talk about like the idea of Taoism and stuff like that. Very much, I love the idea of dream time versus world time. And the problem with humans was, well, they even go to sleep and they need to like sleep to be in dream time. And even then they suck at it,
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. David thought that you saw that as a moment of weakness. That was just them doing what their natural innate abilities do. Because Davidson even questioned that. They're like, is it innate to call them human because they don't act like us? And that's really frustrating. You just want to slap Davidson. It's like, just because someone's different from you doesn't mean that they're any more or less than you. And that's the frustrating thing, because we know dreams can be therapeutic. The dreams can work out your issues. And again, like this community that dreams together, they're working together on that communicative level that Davidson doesn't understand.
Yeah, and it is because of Silver's ability to essentially enter, this dream time in a way that apparently is different, or more elevated. He becomes like a god, to his people, and vice versa. The only other reference to a god was Raj. So I thought that was an interesting comparison. And by the end, as Silver's standing over Davidson, he doesn't see Silver as a god, but Silver sees himself as a god over him.
Right. Well, Silver now sees himself more highly, or he sees himself in a better light, because it is more that self-reflection. Like, I would have never done this, but because I tried to overthrow Davidson and take him out, like, it gave him that false sense of power that I'd like to assume he didn't have before, because that wasn't introduced to him. That wasn't how he was raised. That's not what he knew. But because of these violent acts from Davidson, now he's more aware of this kind of behavior that's foreign to him.
Yeah, and I think, let me know if this was your interpretation of it. He was very much humble with it and didn't see himself as like a permanent god, more of like, this was something bestowed upon him, a role of leadership, and people followed him. But after he had kind of done what he needed to do, he very much, I don't know if he got rid of it, but like, I think that was his intention, to not see himself as a god as soon as all of it was done and dusted. Was that
right, and
your
also,
reading of it?
Yeah, and also, I think I remember from the description is that Silver and Raj were like the same physical kind of size, so it's not like it's the difference between like a 6'5", 300-pound bouncer compared to like a small 120-year-old little guy. It's just not like there was a physical difference where it establishes physical dominance in that sense. And so that fact that like Silver physically hasn't changed, it's his sense of self that changed. And I think it was his actions that like someone has to do something about Davidson, or else, like, if I don't step up, no who's going to, like, no one's going to, so it might as well be me. And that is what I appreciated with Silver's character, that like he's the person that us as the readers were all like, yeah, do something. Someone has to stop him, because he understands what's right and what's wrong, but he actually has the initiative to do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And not that Raj, just being kind of more Indian descent, was going to ever be the white savior, but quite literally, even if he was white, he wasn't the savior. It was Silver. which is a big differentiation from most sort of colonization movies, right?
Mhm.
I don't know. Would you like? And it's interesting that how this is. It's not like a subversion of the trope. It's she very much, kind of fashioned it right before most, at least the stories that I'm familiar with, like let's say Dances with Wolves, Avatar
Mhm.
certainly has that problem, and all that. But I just wanted to get your opinion on that aspect of it.
Well, I think it's good. I mean, good in a way that it's like it's not the whole white savior. It's more of just the person. At this point, it doesn't. I don't think it really matters about the physical appearance. It's the matters of the character, the sense of character, and who is going to step up and who's not, like who has better values, um, and who has the drive and motivation to do something. Granted, Silver, yes, he was angry. Was that the best way to go about um, for retribution? Probably not. But I mean, hell hath no fury, like a man scorned. But I think it's not about the physical appearance anymore. It's about the just the character.
Yeah. What did you? An interesting part was at a certain point, before Raj's demise, if you will, he very much thought of himself as a traitor to his own kind. Um, do you think that was a fair assessment for him, or he was just actually doing the moral thing in the best way that he could?
Yeah, I can understand where he thinks traitors because unlike Silver, he didn't actually do like a big grandiose situation, like a act to dispel his enemy. But I think he felt guilt because maybe his actions were too passive compared to what Silver did. But I think he appreciates the fact that he showed um, he showed some mercy,
Yeah.
and maybe he saw it within himself. Maybe that being too passive and maybe too weak compared to what Silver did, because what Davison is cruel. So maybe he had to do like more substantial kind of act to take out Davison. But because his act was like, no, let's just exile him. Maybe he thought that wasn't enough. Maybe he did deserve death. But that again, that's not within Raj's character either.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because how the book ends overall is with Selvar giving the research away to the humans. He essentially saved the research that Raj had created. Um, Now, whether the obviously the research, that's the bittersweet ending, is the research no longer applies because violence has been introduced to this species, and therefore, you can't put it back in the bottle. But it's a way of allowing Raj's legacy to uphold, and hopefully, I think Silver is optimistic that perhaps they can return to that way of life after some amount of time. I don't, like the idea time heals all wounds sort of a thing. And it's like, get the humans out of here, and maybe,
Right.
and that was the thing, like the idea of, they always thought ahead. I forget the number. It was either 5 generations or 7 generations ahead. Like that's the timeline which you needed to think. And yeah, it's wild, but I think it's a very I think it's a great way to look at stuff because it really helps shape of like, is what I'm doing a good thing or not? How will it affect 7 generations from now? That's a very profound thing.
Right. And I mean, but it's also very sad and true because, generations live a long time. And now that such big violent acts happen now, it's going to take years to get that out of the system,
What would that be?
get them to
300 years?
remember. Yeah, probably around 300 because people in 300 years then won't be alive anymore, or like people now won't be alive in 300 years from that then. So and I think it's really sad because that it took a less amount of time to introduce violence and it takes more time to take it away.
Yeah.
And for it to just kind of phase out with the people and phase out with the time and culture. Time passes slower than the actions that happen. But I think once you remove yourself a long time and far enough away from it, these people do have a chance to fully heal.
They do,
Granted,
but
it might
it's
not be in their time, but
yeah,
there's the possibilities they can get back to what they used to be before the colonists came in.
yeah. It just reminds me of, the typical comedy trope. At like a factory, they have like, you know, 482 days without an accident. And then an accident happens and like the guy, so it just
Yeah,
feels like very much like that sort of aspect of it where it's almost a near impossible task. Like at any point, if we're talking about this 7 generations, and I'll just use 300, again, I don't know if that's fully correct or not, but, seems certainly a long time. So
it's
300
five
years, right?
generations.
Um,
Yeah.
so within that
Sorry, I
time,
had the line. Yeah,
oh,
not for 5 generations. Then perhaps a few men, 10 or 20, no more than 20, might come back to talk to your people. Five
yeah.
generations.
So yeah, 5 generations. Either way, like it just feels like at any point during that time, if like there's a quote unquote accident, it's like back to one.
Yeah, restart,
Yeah.
reset.
So it's a very uphill battle for sure.
Yeah, and the sad thing is that Davison was just one person. Who's to say there aren't more people that could be like him or could do something as heinous as what he did eventually? Not that they did it now, but like who's to say? Or like maybe a woman could, cause violence. We don't know. Um, but it's really sad to think that one person created so much destruction. Who's to say more people couldn't do that? You get
Yeah.
Davison out, someone else could step up.
Yeah, and for her, it was very much a reflection of the the Vietnam War, right? That's what she was kind of responding to when she wrote this. And certainly, even in our own world, like take a look at today, it's like there seems to be an endless supply of heinous people with heinous actions, right? So that's
Uh-huh.
the unfortunate truth. And but tying it to more of the Vietnam War, I want to get your perspective on this. It seems interesting. Part of the whole narrative, you know, communication between the world here and Earth, there's like a 20-year disconnect, or 27, right? Give or
Yeah.
take. And so a lot can happen within that time. And I look at like, any sort of war, but we'll just stick with Vietnam War. Like, as an American audience, you're being fed this news and the tragedy, but you're not seeing it in real time and you don't know how to react to it. Um, and so, in that same way, it's like you essentially have no recourse over what actually happened. So here's Davidson just willy-nilly can do whatever he wants for essentially 27 years. I don't know. I don't know exactly how to like solidify what the thought is. I just found it interesting of that sort of disconnect. And it was a parallel to me, if anything, but
I like that because when like you said, because we don't know like the time delay of 27 years is crazy because just in real time for us on Earth, it's like we had the Vietnam War 27 years after that. Like how many wars were after that, And so to have a 27-year lapse, who knows if someone didn't stop Davison now, who knows what he could have done within 27 years? He could have just been so ruthless and even worse. But because they stopped the delay and they had it at real time, they're like, no, we got to do something now. I like that because it also shows. I mean, there's that level of the science fiction. Like, yes, we're dealing with like two kind of timelines here, but when you take that away, it's like, no, all the violence is happening now. If we don't stop it, we're going to still have violence in 27 years. And I like that was their action, that like just take away
yeah.
that
And
time.
yeah, and they, part of it is they did midway through, let's say, get that machine that communicated more in real time, and then of course that got destroyed as well. But yeah, it just I think as far as what I've seen about this, you know, critiques and deep dives, I've yet to see kind of the communication aspect of it, which I think it plays a huge role, right? And you know, even by the end, all Davidson can do is radio with, you know, headquarters, but it's not like there's a recourse. Like they're like, hey, please essentially stop doing what you're doing. And he's like, no. And it's like, what are you going to do? You can tell him to
Right.
stop, but there's no recourse.
Yeah, it's like someone telling someone over the phone, like, hey, you should stop this, or send an email, and they're like, hey, you should stop this. And you could just ignore it. Like you're 27 years from now, what are you gonna do? So and I think that's why Silver stepped up, because he's like, no, I'm gonna do something about it, because he's not listening to his authorities. So I'm gonna take it into my hands and do something.
Yeah. What did you think? I mean, one of the interesting aspects of this is you don't get very much the military action side of it. Um, you know, it's just kind of more matter of fact and everyone's reaction to it. But it was intriguing to me how Davidson essentially was just destroying everything around him. You know, let's say like you know, they made a note of like a 4 kilometer radius, which was like their walking distance. They destroyed everything. And you're kind of looking at that and it's like, okay, this is very sad. And then I don't know if it was like Selver playing possum because Davidson, you know, his mentality was like, oh, see, I'm big and bad. And then all of a sudden, right after, that's when their camp essentially got wiped out.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean that's it. That's exactly it. It's like the more you destroy, the more power Davison got a hold of him, and it started with I mean, 3 kilometers. That is like what, 2.5 miles? I don't know. That's still a pretty wide range, and if he kept going for 27 years, he would have destroyed the entire planet. Um, and so I think it's just that ripple effect, he starts small and then he eventually is going to get bigger. So I think it just shows that yes, he has this small sense of destruction. If we don't stop him now, it's just going to get bigger, it's going to get worse.
yeah, yeah, I agree. But I also, again, I think it was, I don't know. I'd like to kind of sort of look at it like it was a strategic aspect of, all right, we'll give them a few false victories. Like it's one of those like you may have won the battle, but you're not going to win the war. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think, you know, as you're talking about Davidson's power, it's a false sense, right? It lures you into this aspect of like, oh, I'm almighty, and all of a sudden you think you're big and bad and nothing can get at you. Boom, here you go. Everything is now destroyed. So, and what did you, okay, so a big aspect of this is they kept him alive.
Yeah.
Um, what were your thoughts on that? Because that was very much like, hey, it was interesting because it was an exchange of quote unquote gifts. You know, you gave us the gift of murder. We're giving you the gift of not killing.
Life.
Yeah.
Right. I thought that, I mean, it is just such the clear distinction between these two communities. And then it made me sad for just humans in general, because we are capable of violence and murder. And yet or more so, they encountered another community that is too nice. They're like, well, we're going to exile you, but we're going to keep you alive and still give you food, but you're basically going to be on this barren land by yourself. Like that in and of itself is punishment. But because I think it was they're themselves proving that we're not like you. Because if we were like you, we just kill you right now on the spot and be done with you. But because we're not like you, we're going to give you the gift of mercy and life. The best that we can do is just let you live by exile. And too nice of the Athsheans, but I have to appreciate that they had to stop the violence. They had to end that cycle.
Yeah. And hopefully, as we talk, you know, we talked about the 5 generation healing. Maybe this, you know, kickstarts that. For me, this book just reaffirms the idea that like I will just scream every day. Um, in this world, in this day and age, we could all literally live in a utopia, but every day we actively choose not to. and you cannot convince me otherwise.
I
You
mean,
know,
that's a very, very idealistic way to think about it. But yeah, it's just because
if anything, it's
we're
a cynical way because
so,
I'm like, it's
I
just like,
know.
what the hell? We could end world hunger. Everyone could like have free time and still have earn money and still contribute, but without like digging themselves into the grave. And we could see our families and friends and this, but we actively choose not to.
I know. And as great as that would be, that people love power, people love money. What keeps the world going around? Power, money, food. And some people have more, some people have less. And that therein lies the imbalance and disconnect of the world. And that's why a lot of people think they're better than others, because we have better resources or more resources. There's always going to be an imbalance of the world. Therefore, there's never going to be a utopia, as unfortunate as it is. But that's the world we live in.
I'm gonna live with the Athsheans. Get me over there. I come in
Right.
peace and I will stay in peace.
Exactly. I mean, I think we'd all want to, or well, we could learn something from the Athsheans. That's like, go over there, work with them for a bit. Like, it's kind of like the monks, the peaceful. They're happy. They meditate. They live their lives, and then you can learn a lot from them.
Well, that's
You don't need violence.
and not that this is like a Taoist text, but you can definitely sense the Taoist undertones. And I don't know how much you're familiar with it, but I love. It's not. I mean, it's a philosophy, but in that sort of same way, it's not just like it tells you how to live, right, and be in balance and so forth. And I think, if anything, the bastardization of like the self-help movement is like it just empowers narcissists and ego to be like, well, I'm just putting up boundaries. It's like the true goal of self-help is so you can then help others. Heal yourself to heal the world, not so you can be a heinous asshole to everyone and be like, oh, I'm just speaking like, no, F you. Um, so I don't know, I
Yep.
have a fondness for this book because while it dives into various tropes that we've seen, it's night and day, even if you want to compare it to Avatar. Like, it has a lot of themes. We can go over like the idea that trees communicate, and stuff like that, but like the whole ending is wildly different, which I guess we should talk about. The word for world is forest. We get an answer of why that is, but let's dive into it. Like, what did you think of that?
Yeah, so I put that in my notes. I think it shows that these Athsheans, they like, their language is so different. Their world and the communication is about the actual world, and how they nurture and take care of their surroundings and environments. And then when the colonists come in, like, our world for forests is something temporary. Yes, it's a thing, but we can tear down forests, we can destroy forests. It's just there is two different meanings to the word of forest for them, and I think that distinctly showed the difference. One community saw it as something spiritual and something resourceful, and others saw it as destruction.
Yeah, and I don't have it exactly, but it just came to mind. There's a Taoist principle where there's someone complaining about like this stupid tree, like, it's just in the way, it doesn't do anything, blah, blah. And the Taoist master essentially says, like, well, have you considered it for shade? Like, it's this big tree, it's old, and it's like it provides so much shade and whatever, because the original person complaining, they just were thinking about it in terms of, all right, how do I cut it down for paper or lumber or whatever it may be? So they were trying to fit it to their needs, as opposed to seeing it like, no, it's a beautiful thing, and in its own right, if you look at it, it provides so much. You just got to open your eyes. Again, that's very badly paraphrased in terms of what the principle is, but
no, but it's there. It's like, you have the optimist and the pessimist, or like the two different ways of how someone looks at something. Like, the half full, half empty. A tree provides resource and shade, and another provides paper. And so it's just how two completely different people see one same thing.
And I wouldn't even call it like an optimist versus that. Like, I think that's a fair interpretation, but I go more of like the Taoist is like the realist, which is funny because
okay.
like, in a lot of sense, when you talk about Taoism, people, sometimes, or just enlightened people in general, people kind of can turn them as silly or, too optimistic and not like grounded in reality. And it's like, no, no, no. They're actually more grounded in reality than you can ever even begin to imagine. I think that's and I think this book echoes that sort of sentiment, certainly with dream time and world time and all that. It's like, you think it's all silly. It's actually deep. Like what we know is far more than you could even begin to imagine.
Right. And I think that's what this book does so well. It's just two completely different opinions of how people live their life and how people use their environment and what they do and their behaviors. And not to say one is right or wrong, but it's just the conflicting idea of what they are at the end of the day. Therein lies the disconnect between these communities.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap this out, I do want to point out this was a very successful work. It was part of an anthology at first in 1972 and then published as a standalone in 1976. As I said, it is part of the Hainish cycle. So there's various other books as part of that enrich the lore of it all. And, they're standalone books overall. But again, you can kind of get into it. And yeah, just an amazing writer that is just so incredible. If you want a nice entry point, and I sent this to Marissa, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. It's a like 5-page short story that was my introduction to Ursula K Le Guin, and it's absolutely phenomenal. But any final thoughts before we start to wrap this out?
Yeah, I appreciate this book because yes, it was written decades ago, but it's still relevant now, and I think it's a good cautionary tale to those or just because you don't have the same viewpoint doesn't mean you can't work together. Yeah. Or you should be able to learn how to work together and live and coexist with each other before it escalates to violence. And I think a lot of people now need to read this book.
Yeah. And that was the key difference between Davidson and Raj. Raj looked for the similarities. Davidson saw only the differences. And yes, so long as there's colonization, war, hate, and anger, this book will forever be relevant. And one hopes that it will be an artifact of the past of like, people did this?
Yeah, people are still doing this.
Oh, very much. I mean, listen, again, there is no shortage. We could go, whether Iran or Ukraine, and just the list goes on and on of atrocities. Brazil had their own. Yeah. Anyway, we don't need to.
History repeats itself.
Yes, indeed. Well, to try to bring up some optimism, the next book that we're reading is They Both Die at the End. What a happy title it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a happy title, but I already read it. It's great. I really enjoyed it. I like destroyed this book in like 4 hours on a plane ride. It's easy to read. You had the perspective of two main guys trying to just live the best the day they can together before they die. And it's very heartwarming, and it's so easy to read, and like I thoroughly enjoyed it. So it's lighter in the sense of this book.
Yes,
in the sense that what we just read.
Yeah, I mean, contemplating your own mortality. Sure, it's lighter. But yeah, so that's what's coming up in February. After that, as of now, we have slated The World We Make by N.K. Jemisin. We may we're trying to get more authors on, so we may maybe do some additional stuff. We might swap some stuff to, based on schedules. So, all of our list is subject to change, but, we love books. We're going to continue reading books, and each month we just strive to highlight certain books. And as I said, let us know what you're reading, what you would love for us to discuss. And yeah, our goal is to make this bigger and better. So.
Absolutely. And authors that we don't know, like Ursula K Le Guin, I never heard of her. So I'm always open to reading new authors.
Yeah. So, and for me, Adam Silvera, I'd not read him, so look forward to that. But anyway, connect with us at Serafini TV on her social media. I'm at Phil Svitek. Thank you as always. We appreciate you, and we will both not die at the end of doing the next month's discussion. Take care.